and we get kick-started. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all meeting and dialing in from Aboriginal lands, countries, or nations this morning. I'm personally on the south coast of New South Wales, dialing in from Yuin country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome and acknowledge all of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and peers who may be online with us this morning. Caddyshack Project acknowledges that sovereignty was never ceded. This was, is, and always be Aboriginal lands. And we congratulate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we're thankful for their commitment to country's waterways and for the knowledge that they provide to us in this learning space. So thank you very much. In terms of our On the Couch, we're so glad that you've joined us this morning. Thank you. We acknowledge that often people join On the Couch with several different hats. You may be joining us this morning in a professional capacity, or you may be joining us in a personal capacity with an interest to hear from Chris, or indeed you may actually be joining with both hats on. So as always, we encourage you to practice self-care throughout today's session. And if anything should arise for you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the end of the session. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Chris Cheers to On the Couch. Chris is a psychologist and educator based down in Melbourne. He's very passionate about creating accessible and accepting safe spaces where people become empowered to reach their life goals. It is through extensive training and lived experience that Chris has also developed expertise in providing individual psychology services and workshops to artists and creatives, particularly those in the LGBTIQA+ community. Chris, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out this morning, and congratulations, because we can also now add to your bio that you are an author with the newly released new rulebook, which we will get to touch on today and can't wait to explore a little bit more with you. But I'd really like to kick off this morning's session just by getting you to tell us a little bit more about yourself. How did you get to where you are today?
Sure. Thanks, Naomi. And thanks everyone for joining. I'd like to acknowledge I'm here in Wurundjeri country down in the East Kulin Nations, and acknowledge any First Nations people joining us today or watching this, and acknowledge the long history of supporting wellbeing and mental health within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. When we think about connection to country, to community, to kinship, all these things are so incredibly important for wellbeing and have been practiced here as part of those cultures for thousands and thousands of years. So as you mentioned, I've sort of ended up writing a book, but I've done a lot to get to that point. So I started off, I actually used to be a terrible cabaret performer back in university days. I thought I was going to be a singer, which is where I established a connection with the arts back then, and realized pretty quickly I could not act, but I really wanted to be friends with all the artists. So I kind of did sound and music and technician, anything that could keep me connected to the arts. And then I was studying medical science and realized that me and science didn't quite match. There was something missing. So I went and had my kind of mid-degree crisis and went and studied arts and did philosophy and sociology and French and all these things, and performance studies. And then I ended up realizing I needed a bit of both. So actually, there's probably not many like me. So I've ended up with a double degree in performance studies and neuroscience. And then that went into then psychology, because for me, psychology is a match of both those things, of the arts and of science. I love that psychology these things like emotions and love that we write about in the arts. I love that psychology is the science that tries to understand those from a scientific standpoint as well. So I love being in both those worlds. Ended up becoming a psychologist. I was a child and adolescent psychologist for years, a high school psych, primary school psych. And then I realized I was giving a lot of backyard therapy to a lot of my friends in the arts and a lot of my queer friends. I'm a cisgender man, but I'm a queer man. And so part of the queer community, I realized I was, giving this sort of backyard therapy to all these people, and realized that there was really a need for a lot of people working in that space. So then about 5 years ago now, I launched my own practice, which specializes in that LGBTIQ mental health and mental health for the arts. And that's led to not only individual therapy for those groups, but workshops and organizations, and trying to be a bit of activist in this space of how do we put well-being of artists first, and how do we support the well-being of people in the LGBTIQ plus community in a way that's accessible and understanding and validating, because unfortunately so often it's not. So that's what has led me here today, basically.
Excellent. I just love it. And I think we do get to talk to parts of this a little bit later on, but I think the experience of being in Melbourne, Victoria, the longest lockdown in the world during COVID, we know that Melbourne is quite an artistic, creative, cultural space as well. So I dare say that the last few years has been rather rocky, and that, you know, the clients that you've been working with in that art space in particular, I would just love to hear a little bit more about that. But thank you for that advocacy of community as well. And you know, a little bit of commonality there. I was the same. I was a very failed science student going, what am I doing here? I want to work with people, not molecules. And yeah, ended up in psych as a double major as well. But it's just, like you say, it's that giving back to community and thinking, who am I doing this therapy for, and seeing what the needs are. And just to hear that eclectic kind of frame that you've been able to put on supporting your community is just wonderful. So thanks for that, and for maintaining that advocacy role as well. So I guess that leads me really nicely into the next question in terms of, and you've already sort of touched on it, but if you could elaborate on it a little bit more, just in terms of what's driving that passion and commitment to work within that LGBTIQA plus space.
I think I'm really passionate about working within my community. I think there is a bit of a push in psychologists to kind of be a bit of a blank slate for our clients, that we're meant to not really express anything about ourselves or our identity or who we are. And to a degree, those boundaries, I think, are incredibly important. You know, no one wants to see a psychologist that just talks about themselves. But I think it's also important that people actually feel accepted and validated and safe within their mental health care or sitting down with a psychologist. And what I found was when I made it known what some parts of my identity are, so just knowing that I'm queer, knowing that I'm part of that community, really makes a difference, I think, to some of my clients who are part of that community, especially those who have, and this is, I think, what I've come to know more and more as I work in this space and work with people who are especially trans and gender diverse, who have experienced quite harmful care, you know, from the medical profession, from the mental health care profession. And that's certainly what really I have in the back of my mind. I want to care for my community. I want to be part of this community. I want to do my part to support the long history of people that have really been activists and care for this community. And you know, part of that is wanting to heal and to make it known to especially people who have experienced, you know, harmful or discriminatory healthcare in the past, that this space is for you, and it can be a really important healing space for you.
Yeah, and it's so beautiful to hear that. And I think that we know that the community, the LGBTIQA plus community, do unfortunately experience higher rates of mental ill health, and often that is associated with the gender or sexuality identity, and potentially having family or friends not accepting of that. And so, like you said, to feel that they're coming into a safe space from the outset and know that they're going to be supported by that therapist is so incredibly empowering for the client as well. And I think that it's something that we, you know, there's a lot of community service workers on with us this morning, and I think it is shifting that paradigm and thinking about treating people as people, and really getting back to the core of what is it that they're needing, and what are they accessing our service for. And sometimes we also say, actually, does their sexuality or gender identity even matter to the type of care that you're giving to them? You need to be really mindful of that as well. So thank you for sharing that, and agree that advocacy is just so important. So as I mentioned, new author, so exciting. We are total fangirls here at the Caddyshack Project, and I know that myself and the team have recommended this book to everybody who we speak to. Having had a psychology background myself, I'm like, it's the cheapest therapy you will ever get, $19 at Kmart or the closest bookstore to you. there's some quotes that come out of the book that I just love and would really like to touch on this morning. And I think it will really help us get into this conversation today and breaking down some of the really common themes that you're seeing with your clients and what's happening in community at the moment. So congratulations on the book, first and foremost. But we've really enjoyed how the book takes time out to reflect on how lives have changed so much, and particularly in the last couple of years. And as I mentioned, being a Melbourneian yourself and living through the longest lockdown in the world, I can only imagine what that was like. And it probably gave you a lot of time to be able to sit down with these ideas and time to write a book. But by far my favorite quote of the book is, "I couldn't play by the rules, so I got to write my own." And I would love to hear what that meant for you and what that could mean for our audience today.
Yeah, and this is and what I wanted the book to enter into, this time and space that I'm feeling from people of, this expectation to go back to normal, and people are starting to feel that they don't want to just go back to some of these systems or some of these expectations that were put on them about how they want to live. I feel like sometimes at times of uncertainty, there's a temptation to go back to those structures, to go back to the way things are, as if that will be safe or that will be the way to kind of happiness. Whereas what I want to invite people to do with my book and what I've, I guess, sort of lived through is actually trying to go back to your body and what you need. And so when I write, I couldn't follow the rules, but I live by my own, I think that incredibly comes from the powerful part of being a member of the queer community. I think for me is what that connects to, that, being queer is about sexuality, but in many cases, it's also about, growing up within a society when I was younger, where I didn't feel accepted. I didn't, I experienced homophobia. I didn't have models in my, I grew up in regional New South Wales. I didn't have these models in the town, and to what felt like the kind of life I wanted to have. And when I told, find a girl and get married, and these things just didn't feel right for me. And then as I went to uni and built a confidence, and then went into, psychology and continued to build that confidence, I think that's where I started to think, okay, I can't follow these rules. They don't work for me. And also not only just sexuality, but just the rules of, I talk a lot in the book about like a ladder that we kind of, sometimes in life, we feel like we're kind of given this career ladder or to climb, or this relationship ladder to climb. And we're told if we just follow it, we just do what's expected, we'll get to the top and then we'll be happy. And I think a lot of us can connect to that idea of, we've tried to do that and it hasn't led to perhaps this happy, great life that we're meant to do. So for me, I don't want the book to become just another ladder that you feel like you have to do, or a list of like self-care things that you feel like you need to do. I want the book to invite people to just push down all the ladders and just live every day, according to what you feel like you need, or what your body needs, or what kind of relationship you want, or what meaningful work looks like for you. These are big, difficult questions that I hope the book kind of invites people to get uncomfortable with, to sit in that discomfort and actually try and find their own answers.
To explore. And I just, it really resonated with me personally, and I know it has with a lot of others. And I think you've touched on some really strong key points there in terms of the particular area that you grew up in. And we know that a lot of people within the community will say, I didn't have people who were like me. And interesting that you've now found yourself in the psychology space and working with community in that sense too, because a lot of our psychologists of the past, our Freudians and our Jungs, it's like, I feel, having studied psych, the reason they became psychologists and had their theories was because they were looking for others like themselves to identify, to connect with, and have this sense of, I'm not alone. There are other people out there like myself. It's just, how do I find those people? How do I connect? And then, like you said, once you moved away and you started to have those connections and that maturity, being able to see the world is your oyster, and we don't need to live by a prescription of what should be. And we'll touch on it a little bit more too, but I think people will often become lost in those identities of, I am a mum, I am a sister, I am an uncle, I am a brother, or whatever that identity is. And then what society kind of prescribes that identity as and what that role is. And I just love that that's what the book's focus was, like, let's break down those identities of whatever it is that each individual is identifying as, and get back to your true self and that true authenticity and genuineness. And we'll touch on that when we talk about your values in just a moment. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, I guess following on from that theme about returning to normal and what was normal, what is normal, we could talk all day about that in and of itself. But our world feeling very orientated towards the out, and it's noisy and it's busy and it's really distracting. How can we as individuals cultivating that turning inwards and, like you said, just tuning back into our bodies and our minds and thinking about what it is that we're actually needing or craving in our lives right now? Are you able to talk to that a little bit in terms of practicality? Like, how do we actually do that?
And I think practicality is a great word to use here, because I think there's a danger as psychologists or, or in these sorts of panels, or that we talk about these things at a very theoretical level, like to live authentically, to, live a life of meaning, to turn inward, which, are great concepts to sort of talk about. But I think when it comes to actually doing them, it is a practice. And a lot of what I want the book to do, and a lot of what I do as a psychologist, is experiential, is thinking about, well, but how do you put this into practice? How do you actually go from, sitting down and actually working out what an authentic life looks like for you? Like that is, and in the book, I go through a clear kind of practice for that, because that's a really difficult thing to do. The same with turning inward. I think for me, turning inward is something that I have to learn how to do. So for me, what that means is, first off, remembering that emotions are a way we make meaning of the life. So turning inward for me is actually starts with recognizing my emotions. So I often, during the day, or most days, and this is the point of I put a reminder in my phone, I put it in my calendar to create space to go inward, or to create space to check in. It'll just be in my calendar. It'll just say like check in. And for me, that means I ask myself 3 questions. I go inward, I say, how am I feeling? And I might name that emotion, or I might, recognize how I'm feeling physically in the body. I then say, why does it make sense that I feel like that? Because so much of our life is telling us that we shouldn't feel a certain way, or that our feelings are our fault or mean we're faulty. So I always ask myself that question, why does it make sense that I feel like this? Because I want people to recognize the stuff beyond their control that's leading them to feel like this. Like anxiety is a normal reaction to the world right now. So how do I feel? Why does it make sense that I feel like this? And then what do I need? And what do I need, I think, in terms of like right now, so in that check-in, after that check-in, I might go and I invite people to do this today, after this panel, like just do what you need. It might be just, and I don't mean like, quit your job and walk out the door unless that's where your body leads you. But I mean, just like go and have a glass of water, go and sit down, go and read 5 pages of a book. My piano is just sitting right behind me. Often it's like, I just go and play a song, or I go for a 5-minute walk, or I eat something, giving ourselves permission to just even have 10 minutes in our day where we're listening to our body. That's the kind of practice that I think we just do that repeatedly, and it builds a different relationship with your body, where your body's signals and emotions start to become something you can listen to, rather than something that's seen as a distraction from your work or a distraction from your day.
I love it. And I definitely just took notes of those 3 points, and I'm going to start to practice that, because I really like that. And self-care is something that we've been speaking a lot about in our professional space, and that often people see self-care as this, it's a massage, it's a cocktail on the beach, it's a, something that you have to schedule and often costs money. And we're like, we want you to flip how you're thinking, excuse me, about that, and think, you've just hit the nail on the head. How do I incorporate that 10 minutes into my workday? How do I make sure that I'm stepping away from the computer and that work life and just taking that time out for me? That, like you said, that quick walk around the block, go and sit in the sunshine and just soak up some vitamin D for 5 minutes in fresh air. Those small things can be quite meaningful and add up to really big things. And just being able to check back in with yourself. And I think it's also really nice, because you could also use those 3 points to check in with others as well.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. Sitting down with someone and saying, how do you feel? Let me tell you why it makes sense that you feel like that. And I think one of the most important questions in organizations, in relationships, in anywhere, is what does support look like for you right now? I use that all the time because it releases us of this pressure to know how to care for people, which is sometimes why we don't enter the conversation. I think just learning that, what does support look like for you right now, has been really impactful in a lot of the work or kind of community environments I've been part of.
And I really like that language as well, because we often talk about the language that we're using and how just shaping some of that language or saying things in a slightly different way can really change the meaning of what it is that you're having a conversation around. And so, yeah, I really like that flip of what does that support look for you right now? And then that's the best way someone can describe what they're needing, and then the best way that we can then meet that need. And as I said, many community service providers online today, people are coming to us with a need. We're service providers, yeah. So I really like that language. Thanks for sharing that. So you've already sort of touched on this, and you've definitely already used this word this morning, but I'd like to go back to it and hear a little bit more. This term, constructive discomfort, like sitting in this discomfort and getting okay with being uncomfortable around things. Are you able to elaborate on that a little bit further for us, please?
Yeah, I really lent into a lot of the studies, the neuroscience of emotions, when I started going into this chapter, and also the work of Susan David, who wrote a book called Emotional Agility that some of you may be aware of. And I remind as well that after today, you'll get an email of a PDF that has heaps of links to books and things in it. And one of them is Emotional Agility. And for Susan David, emotional agility is the capacity to turn towards our emotions and see them as a normal part of living a meaningful life. Or to put it another way, Susan David's favorite quote is, discomfort is the price of admission for a meaningful life. And what I take from that, and what my work in emotions has then become about, is how often we are taught rules about emotions that we grow up with, that, don't get upset here, don't get angry, now's not the time, boys don't cry, no need to get upset, don't be like that. We messages time and time again that is telling us that there's not a space for our emotions. And this is the same with toxic positivity. It's just as unhelpful if you're feeling like crap and someone says, you've got this, it's, don't worry, like this. We have this thing where we feel like it's sometimes our job as carers, as parents, as friends, to make people feel happy, where often what we need to do is create space for that discomfort, to say to someone, it makes sense that you feel like this, I'm here for you, let's talk about this emotion, let's validate this emotion. I think that is how we can start to see emotions not as this thing that's distracting us, or that we shouldn't be feeling, or that we don't have space for, or we need to like distract ourselves from, like social media and Netflix and all these things. They're really effective in the short term for kind of distracting ourselves from emotions, but the emotional agility skills that I try and teach people in the book are about being compassionate and curious for our emotions, to remember that our emotions, before even our brain kicks into gear, our emotions are the thing that give us information about our environment. They're the thing that help us make meaning of the world. So being compassionate or constructive discomfort is about giving meaning to our emotions. And that doesn't make them go away, just because you give meaning to your suffering, meaning to your pain, doesn't make the pain go away, but it does, allow you to create more space for it, it's still there. And, anyone who's been through grief, for example, will understand what I'm talking about when I say that emotion doesn't go away. We learn to make space for it. We learn to see it as part of our life rather than overwhelming. So that's what I mean by constructive discomfort, making meaning of your emotions and helping them to lead you to a meaningful life, and to see them as part of that meaningful life.
Yeah, to own those emotions. And I think what really sticks out for me when you're talking then is the validity of it. Like, it's valid that those emotions are existing. And like you said, it's completely okay that you're going through whatever that particular emotion is. And we all work through emotions very differently in our own time and space and place as well. So I'm going to keep tracking on a little bit with that emotion, and that sometimes we feel really scared or overwhelmed by some of those emotions that are coming up. And I love how you talk about surrendering to our emotions. So, that doesn't mean that we won't stop crying or that we're not going to get stuck in a rage, but what does surrendering to those emotions actually mean, or what does that look like?
Yeah, the concept of surrender, I guess, is when we're giving up on the wish that things were different, or we are, that old kind of Carl Rogers quote that accepting things as they are is always the first point of change. I think I'm not surrendering to emotions is not about, creating the emotions. It's not about like trying to bring them out of you. What I'm talking about there is just an idea of just surrendering to it, and surrendering it to what it is. We have all this language around emotions that make them out as the enemy sometimes. So a panic attack, for example, like panic attack is like the worst marketing for something that's ever existed, because it's not nothing's attacking you. It's not an attack. And we give it this language that makes it an enemy, that makes it something, that is, out to get us, or we have to fight against. Whereas I think surrendering to emotions is about, and this is difficult to do, but it's about developing the skills of being able to accept and understand and create space for the emotion in the first instance. And often that it's, as I said, it doesn't make the emotion go away, but it can often stop that cycle that can sometimes really lead to more panic, that we get anxious for our anxiety, then we get angry that we're anxious, and then we feel guilty that we're angry that we're anxious. And this kind of cycle can begin. I think one way to, change that cycle is to work on naming, and sometimes it's just about, what's sometimes termed emotional granularity, or that idea of actually giving space to name and our specific emotion, and then use that to kind of validate it, can really start to change that process, I think. So I guess that's what I mean by surrender, actually accepting or naming that first emotion, seeing it not as an enemy, but remembering that our emotions are a normal physiological system of our body. They're there for a reason.
I was going to say, I just think those emotions are what are keeping us safe often. Yeah. Like they're those instincts of, you may not be safe in this particular situation, or you're responding based off of that fight, flight, freeze, fawn. It's a safety mechanism that kicks into. And I'm just going to read out this quote from the book around this emotional stuff, because it really struck a chord. So we've learned that if we're tired, we should drink coffee. If we're sad, take a pill. Our anger needs management. Our excitement is too much, and our jealousy is ridiculous. Our fear of unwarranted and our anxiety is pathological. We're told that being too emotional is a bad thing. So, quote unquote, nice little ribbon on that emotional section. But if there's anything else that you'd like to add to that, I'd really love to hear it.
No, I would only add that it's a hard one practice, emotional agility. It's something that I still have to do every day, as I approach a lecture or a panel. I still get anxious. I still have to name it and allow space for it. And, I still shake often when I'm giving, big presentations and that sort of thing. And I often, remember, okay, it's normal that I feel like this. I have to go through that process, and it does change my experience of it. But it's something, it's a daily practice.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Really appreciate it. I'd like to talk about values now, if that's okay. And, values it's probably another one that's when we talk about language and values, and what are your values and what's your why and what's your purpose. But I'd like to think about values in the sense of, how are we using those values to determine or shape our why and give purpose to what it is that we're trying to achieve, either it be in work life, in personal life. Where do values sit?
Yeah, values is something that I'm sure everyone joining today, especially if you work in the mental health care space or any support spaces, you've done values work, or you've certainly done this work before, and I certainly have. And when I sat down to write this chapter, it's a chapter about work, and it was very interesting to me that this chapter is not about work at all. It kind of starts questioning that work for a lot of us has become this space where we feel our productivity is our worth, that we've kind of chosen our, as I said before, our career ladder, and we feel like we have to. There's a lot of, I have to, I should, that this is just the way it has to be. And I think, why this chapter became not about that very quickly is I wanted to try and detach people from this idea that your worth is productivity, that your work is your identity, is something where we get stuck sometimes. That, and a lot of the artists I work with are like, I am an actor, I'm a director, and so when their work is not going well, or when they receive feedback about their work, obviously it's taken very personally because they've kind of become their work. And this is the same with doctors or psychologists. So you might yourselves connect to some of this stuff where our work starts to become our identity. And what I want people to examine is, and this comes from a lot of the work of acceptance commitment therapy, really, that I've practiced for years, is seeing our life as made up of multiple domains, or as I call them, multiple pillars, of work being one of them, but also your relationships, but also your leisure time, also your spirituality, or whatever your domains are. What I want people to kind of start to think about is, how can you live a meaningful life across all those domains? And a meaningful life for me means living aligned with your values. And that sentence, I find we kind of understand and we talk about, living by your values. But what I think is the problem is, values are useless if you don't actually put them into action. And I think this is the thing we don't spend enough time doing, is actually, this is where I kind of often talk about the idea of, we need to stop setting goals. I'm not talking about thinking about your values and thinking about, in a year's time, I want to be here, or, in 6 months' time, I want to be doing this. Sometimes goals can be motivating. If they work for you, that's great. But sometimes goals can be a distraction from the idea that today you can do small, achievable things that are living by your values. And change in our life, we have this, I think, problematic idea that change is about sheer willpower. Like, if I just set the goal and just build the willpower and build the motivation, that I can do it, I can make myself do it. And I'm sure we've all done that before. We've set goals and they just haven't happened. Because the actual way we change our life, or to make it look more like a meaningful life, I think starts with just setting what I call actions, which are little things you can do in the next 24 hours that align with your values. So one of my values is, beauty, connection, authenticity. So one thing I sometimes do is, I talk about, as I said, sitting down and playing a song on the piano, or listening to a song I love, or just going to take a photo just for the sake of being creative today. Messaging a friend you haven't seen for a long time might be how you live by your value of connection. And then feel a sense of achievement when you do that little thing. And that's what causes change in life. Little achievable actions add up. And I think sometimes with values, we can get a bit lost in this. We want our meaningful life to look completely different, which I call dreams. I think dreams are a wonderful thing. And I actually, always talk about people sitting down and dreaming big, absolutely. But then when it comes to actions, I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about the next 24 hours than we do thinking about where we want to be in a year.
Oh, I really, really like it. And, values are something that is often quite personal, and sometimes people don't often talk publicly about their values, but you absolutely have gone public with your values because you published them in your book. And so I'd like to touch base, because you've spoken about that connectivity, and you also talk about authenticity, courage, and talking about care within community. Let's hear it. Come on, let's unpack it.
Well, first off, I would say it's hard to live by our value. I want to really name that it takes a lot of constructive discomfort. It takes a lot of creating space for emotions to live by our values. For example, authenticity. It is impossible to be authentic all the time. I'm certainly not suggesting that that's me, but I do all the time think about, how can I be authentic today? What is the way to do that? That's become so important in my work. I'm an educator, so I lecture. In my writing and in my job as a psychologist, I can see the value of authenticity, because I think being authentic is, in the book I define love, which is a whole other thing. But one of the things that I define love by is having a sense of connection and belonging in a relationship. And for me, connection and belonging has to start with authenticity. You can't feel genuinely like you are accepted by someone unless you genuinely share who you are.
Yeah.
And I think that's what authenticity means for me, that even though it's difficult and hard, trying to think about how can I be myself as the starting point for building really genuine, valuable relationships in my life. So then that leads into connection, that leads into caring for community, because I think caring for community, the more authentic I can be for a lot of people in my community, the more likely they are to trust me. You know, trust is often built on people knowing who you are and trusting you as a person, which sometimes take authenticity. And, you know, these things, the values kind of go together for me, but I think they are also something that I guess changes as well. Like I want to always create space for that, because sometimes when I sit down with people and ask them, you know, what are your values? I know that can be a daunting task for people. So I often kind of rewind it back and say, you know what, I'm not asking you to define what a meaningful life is right now. I'm just saying today, you know, what seems most important for you at the moment, though those can be a value. So really allowing space to kind of chop and change our values as we ourselves grow and change as well.
Nice. And I'd like to ask you a question just around authenticity, because again, reflecting on the fact that a lot of people joining us today are in support roles, care roles, and I know that I certainly felt this for myself. I think authenticity comes down to consistency, and particularly in those support roles or even those therapeutic roles where you're seeing clients on an ongoing basis. They come to you and build rapport with you because of a certain persona or authentic personality or person that you put across. And so say you weren't consistent in that authenticity, they come to the next appointment and feel like you've changed as a person. That has a really big impact in support roles. Yeah. So I kind of used to talk about, you know, it doesn't matter if you see me in therapy on a Friday afternoon or walking, you know, in the shops on a Saturday morning, I'm probably going to be presenting as myself in very similar clothing, very similar look and appearance. And it's sort of like a no surprise package, or otherwise the way I think about it is Barbie doll. You collect the whole set, like you get the therapist person, you get the, you know, tennis on a Saturday morning person, you get the mum person. But do you see a connection with that, like in terms of authenticity and being consistent, and that might be linked together?
Yeah, and what I'm interested in is also you know, think of that collection of Barbies, like what is consistent between them. You know, I as a psychologist, you know, I very much understand the role of support workers that we must have boundaries. Like self-disclosure, you know, can be inappropriate and unhelpful, you know, in a lot of therapeutic roles. But what I say there is, you know, authenticity without boundaries is not useful, you know, and I mean that both in professional roles, but in personal roles as well. You know, there's in a lot of relationships, you can't just, you know, be authentic and be honest 100% of the time. That there will be times where that won't be helpful for a relationship as well. So when I talk about authenticity, my authenticity always has boundaries, but underneath those boundaries or underneath all those roles I play, I like to think that I know who is that consistent self. That self that is able to observe what I'm doing and is able to say, right now you are not being totally authentic, but it's because of this, or it's because there's a decision here that in this circumstance, that's not going to be helpful, you know? So as a psychologist, you know, there's obviously a lot of stuff I don't talk about myself in that space because I know that that's helpful for the clients. And same with, you know, relationships with family versus with friends, you know, there's certain things you talk differently about in those different spaces, but underneath it there needs to be an authenticity. And what I ended up talking a lot about in this book is authenticity, actually, which I wasn't expecting. And what I want people to acknowledge is that to live authentically is a very hard one, because we're up against not only the expectations of a society around us that tells us we have to be a particular way or work a particular way or, you know, be a particular way in relationships, but also we grow up with mindsets or beliefs that we're taught as children that give us messages about what parts of us are okay and what parts of us aren't. Or grow up with this idea that we're not enough, or that part of us is not okay, or that part of us is too much. And I think the kind of quest to live authentically is a lifelong process, and it is often about unlearning those two things, unlearning the expectations put around you by the world, and also unlearning some of those beliefs that you've learned in your development, and then seeing the authentic self that can come through that is I think part of the lifelong process. I try and introduce people to kind of start through the book.
So empowering and insightful. So thank you very much for sharing that. And it really leads really nicely into just this little point on trauma. And I think that, you know, what you've just said there in terms of our childhoods and what we've potentially absorbed or taken on, in this real strong sense sometimes of, am I enough? We know that trauma-informed care is definitely having a moment right now, and definitely working on making sure that it's here to stay in terms of acknowledging people's backgrounds and stories, and that we're all individuals with different experiences. How do you incorporate that trauma-informed care into especially the therapeutic work that you're doing with clients? Where's that fitting in?
Yeah, it's about, I mean, and the book comes to mind to begin with, because the book very carefully at the beginning has a section where it really invites people to consider whether they're ready to do this work through a book, or whether they need, and if the book brings up big emotions, you know, or big, you know, emotional experiences, and, you know, invites people to seek care. Because what I know is that sometimes doing a self-care book or going to see a psychologist cannot be helpful if that space is getting you to relive your trauma, to talk about your trauma in a way where you don't feel supported. So what trauma-informed practice means for me is making sure that there is a safe foundation before someone processes, you know, their trauma. For me, the process of what I've learned is, for me as a psychologist, what I lead people to do is to process their trauma. And what I mean by that is to be able to create an understanding of a past or a traumatic experience that you can incorporate into a sense of yourself, that it becomes something that you can see in a particular way, build a narrative around, build an understanding of, process in a way that it can become integrated into you and into your sense of self. And that work requires a sense of safety and a sense of being able to regulate your emotion, a sense of being able to acknowledge and name when your body is becoming overwhelmed, when your emotions are becoming overwhelming, so we can regulate them, so we can go back to talking about that. So for me, a lot of the work of being trauma informed is much more about what the work you do before you start talking about the trauma. And for me, that's about being the kind of psychologist that makes people feel safe and validating. But it's also about being aware that this person has the skills or the ability to do this work, but before you begin. And I think that can be an issue, is if we fall into this myth that talking about stuff is always helpful, because talking about really challenging, difficult, traumatic experiences in the past isn't helpful if you're just going to put it out there and then the session ends and you're just going to go home alone. You know,
That's right. It's re-traumatizing, if anything. It's
exactly. And I think we all need to understand that, and as a community need to know that, and think about not only how do we make sure that the session maybe is supportive, but how do we make sure that we're aware that this person has supports before and after, you know, when they're doing this work. I think I've worked with a lot of social workers in my time, and I have such a deep respect and for what I've learned through them, and what was missing in to be honest, my education as a psychologist, that this idea of understanding systems and you know, as psychologists, sometimes we focus far too much on the individual, this idea that the problem is in the individual, and so you as an individual need individual therapy, so you as an individual can do the work, so you can be, you know, it's so focused on the individual. And I think it misses what is really important, was doing the work to try and understand the systems that may be discriminating, oppressing, to know what protective factors are around for this person, and also to just know, you know, what are some bigger, systemic factors that might be influencing and impacting this person as well.
And because they're existing as more than just an individual, because they are family members, they're community members. It's, it's bigger than just the individual, 100%. And just touching on that trauma stuff, I think that's one of the key things that we talk about in terms of the semantics or the language. And it's like, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you, and being able to explore that in a much deeper way. And, you've spoken about your work within the art industry, and I think it's pretty fair to say that they are by far the most affected people out of COVID in terms of career and lifestyle and things like that. Are you able to talk to how you kept, I guess, being inventive and creative in the space and being able to provide therapy to that group of individuals?
Yeah, it was a tough couple of years. But, as you said, a lot of my clients, who were actors, performers, musicians, they lost overnight. They just lost their entire, all their work, and there was no sense of when it was coming back. Yeah. And there was also, for a lot of them, because a lot of them were casual or employees within the arts or in short-term contracts, didn't receive, JobKeeper didn't receive supports during this time. So a lot of my work was just about trying to support them to find a sense of, that Maslow's hierarchy stuff, just building a sense of safety, a sense of housing, a sense of, and a sense that they had in place enough to make sure that they would be okay. They would be able to, it's hard to even put myself back in that place, but for a lot of artists, it was, can I pay rent? Can I be home? Can I have food on the table? But once we worked on through that, I think it was about trying to find, and I go back to, I guess, Viktor Frankl's work sometimes here in Man's Search for Meaning, the idea that even in the most difficult of circumstances, the one thing that can never be taken from you is your ability to choose your attitude towards those circumstances. That's Viktor Frankl. And I think for a lot of artists and creatives, what I helped is build a reframe or a different attitude towards this set of circumstances. How, even though this was completely unexpected, difficult, challenging space, how could they live by their values within this space? How could I support artists to pivot to still being creative in different ways? And I talked a lot to artists about during that time how, although the how they made their work looked very different, the why they made their work would be consistent. So we talked a lot about why, a lot about their values, and learn new ways to pivot to different ways of expressing that, and using that space to do things differently. And also, that Viktor Frankl idea of making meaning of suffering became really important to me at that time. The idea that those emotions that were there, that were so challenging and difficult to deal with, it felt like that because what they do is important, and I think that's the reframe we can often give to suffering, that it doesn't make it feel better, but it allows us to give it meaning, that this thing that you're striving for, this thing that is missing from your life, is so important to you, and you're a part of a history of artists who it has also been important to you, that has, that have fought up against systems and to make their art happen. And I think during those times of suffering, that idea of self-compassion, the idea of, know that suffering is something that's experienced by all, became really, and down here in as strange as it sounds, there was such a sense of connection during that time for us, even though we're also isolated, because we were doing it together. And I think the more we could connect to that, the more it helped us all kind of get through.
And keeping community together, and probably coming back stronger, louder, more creative than ever before, because you have had some time and space to be able to work on that creativity as well, and probably coming out and being creative in really different ways to previously as well. So I want us to go on the up and push towards the end with the up. And you mentioned there's a whole section in the book around love and connection, and I really like this reference to the Dunbar social network and talking about the 150 connections that we have in our lives and what those layers of connection are. So essentially, potentially we have about 150 connections within our lives. 100 of those are going to be family or relationships. 35 of those are going to be good friends. 10 of those are going to be our core crew. 5 of those will be our besties, and 1 to 2 intimates. Are you able to talk us through these layers of social connection and thinking about, especially those intimates and those core crew?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, so this is the work of Robin Dunbar, who just actually wrote a book just after I brought out mine, actually, called Friends. It's all about this kind of his research that he's doing for decades, which is examining. It came from first cognitive work with our brains and relating to primate brains, and there's a science behind this that he started to look at what is the, I guess, ultimate number of connections. In some ways, the number of close connections that your brain can sort of handle cognitively is another way to think about it. And for me, this became really important because a lot of what I wrote about in love, so I'm queer, as I said, I'm queer, but I'm also polyamorous. So I have 2 partners. A lot of people, about half people in the queer community now are what we sometimes call ethically non-monogamous or consensually non-monogamous, meaning they have multiple partners. And I think not only queer people, but a lot of people are starting to question the way that we focus on finding the one and having one relationship. And what I wanted my chapter about love to be about is, yes, that one partner might be an incredibly intimate, important partner, but we also, the way to, I think, good well-being is actually to know that all the close relationships in our life are important. And
they all serve a purpose, because not one person could serve all of our needs in any given relationship.
And so many, I think, sometimes focus so much on maybe 1 or 2 or some really close relationship and maybe not so much on the others. And I think that's what I talk about in the book about building a sense of community, is knowing that it's not just one partner who is, that you just have to spend the rest of your life with and everything will be happy. It's actually about thinking about, well, who are the important people in your life? Who are your us? Or as I talk about, your core crew. So for Robin Dunbar, when you add your intimates and your sort of close friends and this kind of your besties, this kind of group of really the kind of people that you would, allow to look after your children, the kind of people that you would go to no matter what, adds up to around sort of the 15 to 20 mark. So, Robin Dunbar has specific numbers, but he allows a bit of leeway.
Flexibility.
So what that means for me is what we need to think about is who are your 15? And that includes family, friends, partners. Thinking about that group of people and it's not about honoring, blood relationships more than others. It's not about honoring people you're married to more than others. It's about thinking, who are your people? Who are your us? Who are your core crew? And thinking about how can you love them? So that's where I use the word love. I define love as putting belonging, connection, and safety into action for not just your one partner, but for your us, for your community.
Yes.
And I think it's so powerful on many levels to go into that space, but especially where the reaction to the book and those chapters specifically, I've seen it being really important for people who do not have a partner right now, or who are not married, because they talk about as if they're seen as like failed or like. And what I really want this chapter to do is tell them that, you're the people who are at a deficit in terms of connection are not people who are not married. It's people who are not enacting authentic love with the important people in their life, who are not having that sense of belonging and connection and safety into action. So that's what I want that chapter to do, is to say, whatever kinds of relationships work best for you, know who those important people are, and then think about how you can enact that love with all of those people, not just this kind of patriarchal kind of maybe religious idea of like the one you marry has to be held above all.
Yeah.
it's love is actually community. Love is who are your people, and how do you put that love into action?
And I can see just from a few comments coming through the chat box, I know that there's a lot of people sitting at their computer right now or their device just going, mind's blown. And it is, and I think about that. Jen just made the comment, Michelle Obama refers to that as the people at the kitchen table. And I refer to that as, who am I around that actually energizes me? Like, once I've spent time with them, I leave feeling like my cup is full, I'm energized, not that they've drained me. And particularly when, I know a lot of us are in supportive roles and people kind of pull on us and go, oh, well, I know you're a counselor or you're a psychologist, and I'm, going to ask you all these therapeutic works within a social setting. But who is it that you're around that actually reinvigorates your passion for life and really provides you with that energy? And I doubt that there would be a single one person in our life that could fill all of those cups for us. And I know that there is a movement, and I certainly have started to do this more in my personal life. It is telling people that you love them, like legit love them for the reasons that they are in your life. My colleagues have been on the receiving ends of a few of love yous recently, and definitely my friends. And my friends are picking up on it and actually returning it and going, there's gratitude around these connections and what it is that we're providing for each other at this time. And it's just try not to get teary about how beautiful that really is. But look, let's move on. In the book, you talk about the foundation of love being self-acceptance, and that safe is sexy because safety is the foundation of what allows relationships to be fun, spontaneous, and creative. And that definitely ties into the importance of self-esteem that we have spoken to a little bit today. But it also gives some kudos to those notions of pleasure and excitement. And I think that's what the spontaneity brings. But are you able to talk a little bit more about that in your love section?
Yeah, well, as I said, love for me is a commitment to action. So as you said before, it's beautiful to use this word, like I love you, I ought to use the word love, and I think it's really important to think about how we're using the word, because for me to say I love you, and I do say I love you to my friends, I said, as I said, to my kind of core people. But what I love about Dunbar's work that I try to use is that you can't love everyone. you when I talk about, I think it's important to see love as a commitment to, Dunbar says kind of around, well, and I've kind of used this work to create this theory, but around those kind of 15 to 20 people, those are the people I would say you should say I love, because for me to say you love someone is a commitment to that relationship, is a commitment to make that relationship work. And to me, it's a commitment to creating a sense of belonging. So that means, and you can't feel a sense of belonging to a group unless you are yourself, because belonging comes from, this is who I am, and someone says, I love that person. I understand and I validate that person. So that's what I mean. Like, it has to start with self-acceptance. We need to accept ourselves before we can then do that really difficult, vulnerable thing of sharing that self with someone else.
Love it.
That's connection. And then, as you talked about, the other part of love is safety. And I think we talk about sex, we talk about pleasure. These things in some of your relationships will be part of some of that 15. Sex will be part of some of those relationships. And that is where safety comes in. Safety is when we get to play. Safety is when we get to, that safety is often the foundation for good sex, for that kind of pleasure. But for me, safety also means boundaries. So in the book, I talk a lot about how we set boundaries, how we express boundaries, how we communicate boundaries, because in the end, boundaries in relationships are also what allow us to feel safe. So for me, that's a real part of love as well.
Love it. And you heard it here first on the couch. I reckon there's a saying, and I reckon it's not I love you, I love us and what we are together. Heard it here first. Could be a good second book title, and I want in on it. Look, it wouldn't be a Caddyshack couch session if we didn't talk about sex. And so I just want to touch on the quote, let's remove the idea of love from sex. Sex is not a measure of love. Are you able to discuss that point for us?
Yeah, for me, I like to separate love and desire. I like to separate, because for me, love, as I said, is something we feel for friends, is something we feel for other people in our lives that we're committing to have acceptance, belonging, connection with. I think why I like to separate the two is, I think sex, it's okay sometimes that sex requires work to be maintained in a safe, playful, way in a relationship. So you can love someone intimately, like closely, have that, and you can be intimate with someone, but sometimes to maintain sex because of a million, as you all know, you know, the million different reasons why sex changes with time, libido changes with time, you know, that I think I like to separate the two, because I want people to know, to be able to say I love you to someone, but sex isn't, it's for us right now, we need to work on it. And that work, I don't want it, I wish there was a different reason, a word for work, because I don't want it to sound like work, because it can be playful and fun, and that's what it should feel like. But
we commit to it. We need to commit to it. It's
and
changing. It takes
exactly,
commitment.
and commit that it's uncomfortable and weird to sometimes do some of these things, but I think separating it allows us to have a conversation about it, because when we connect the two, that love and like sex are the same, it makes it hard to talk about to our partners, because it feels like we're saying that the relationship is dying, or that this, if we can't, you know, this is a problem that means we're going to have to break up. That's the kind of language I think that begins when we start to see love and sex as the same thing. What I want people to think about is saying, you know, we love each other, we're committed to each other, to making this work. We got to work on this sex thing, you know, and that's okay, because the idea of keeping a playful, pleasurable, you know, sex life with someone for decades is a ridiculous idea. You know, it's really challenging, and it's okay that requires some help, some work, some, you know, and I think that's the kind of conversations I want people to be having.
I love it. Thank you so much for unpacking that for us. And as we are coming to the end, I want to use your own quote because it is just so joyous. Let's awkwardly, curiously, and compassionately move forward towards embracing uncertainty. And if the last few years have taught us anything, I think that uncertainty is what we weren't expecting, and it's what we've got. And I just love that we can move forward to embrace that uncertainty. So on behalf of myself and Caddyshack Project, Chris, we thank you so, so much for being with us on the couch this morning. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I have no doubts whatsoever that everybody online has taken at least one or two really key points and messages from your session. I've particularly found it empowering, even having read the book and having a few conversations with you now. Definitely going to reflect on those 3 points of checking in. So thank you everyone for joining us this